Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our May 2022 edition of Voices for the West, a webinar series brought to you by Advocates for the West. My name is Will Shoemaker, and I am Communications and Engagement Director at Advocates for the West. We're honored to be joined tonight by Elizabeth Hightower Allen and Madeline Kerry, along with Advocates for the West Senior Attorney Todd Tucci. The title of tonight's webinar is The Gila and Beyond, Wilderness Designation at 100 Years. That title is partly in reference to the Gila Wilderness in modern-day New Mexico, which was not only America's first designated wilderness, but the world's first as well. So that we can better get to know each other, please take a minute and drop into the chat your favorite part about the Gila, if you have been there before, and if you haven't been there before, what interests you most about the area? I am going ahead and writing in wolves. That's what interests me most. If you guys would, please take a minute and so we can better get to know each other, let us know what it is for you. Before we dive in, I do want to note a couple housekeeping items for tonight. You will remain on mute throughout the presentations as an attendee. However, we do welcome your questions, At the bottom of your screen, in addition to the chat function, you'll also see a Q&A section. If a question comes to mind at any point during tonight's presentations, feel free to go ahead and drop it in the Q&A section. You don't have to wait until the end of the talks to do so. And we'll discuss as many of those questions as time allows toward the end of the webinar. So let's see. Fire is what Madeline wrote in the chat. Anyone else, if there's something you want to share with us, please do so. We'd love to hear what interests you about the Gila. I will say that I, for one, am very excited to kick things off tonight with a conversation with Elizabeth Hightower Allen. Before I introduce Elizabeth, I'd like to draw attention to a partnership between Advocates for the West and Torrey House Press. For purchases through the end of the day today, Torrey House is generously donating to Advocates for the West 20% of sales of the anthology, First and Wildest, the Gila Wilderness at 100. As an attendee, you should have received an email this morning containing a discount code to use, as well as a link to the page where you can purchase that book, First and Wildest. Of course, we're joined tonight by Elizabeth, who edited the book. Elizabeth is contributing editor at Outside Magazine, where she spent 20 plus years editing award-winning features and writing columns and book reviews. She's a transplanted Southerner turned Westerner living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she edits books and articles about public lands, memoir, and adventure, and serves on the advisory board to Writers on the Range. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having us and taking an interest in the book. It's exciting.
Sure thing. I've been enjoying my copy of First and Wildest in recent weeks, and I thought maybe to help orient us, we could talk at the outset here about what this area that is called the Gila Wilderness is. You know, generally, what can you tell us about it, and maybe what does it represent to you personally or from a conservation standpoint?
Well, so it's so wild and rugged. I mean, I've heard it described as really the Southwest counterpart to Yellowstone in terms of its size of protected areas and wild areas, and in terms of the biodiversity it holds there. So it's just so rugged. It just feels like old, like the roads go on top of the ridges instead of down in the valleys, and you just see miles and miles of these like folded mountains, and some of them fire scarred. The Gila Wilderness itself is, as you guys have been saying, the first wilderness. Was proposed by Aldo Leopold in 1922. He was then a forest ranger working down there. And then actually he had been. But it's also surrounded by 10 million really wild acres, some of which are protected and some of which are not. There's 1 million acres of other designated wilderness in addition to the 500,000 of the Gila Wilderness. And then there are 1.5 million acres of roadless areas that are still unprotected. So it's sort of the last great Southwest conservation piece of the puzzle for big wild landscapes.
How did you become involved in this project to put together the book, First and Wildest?
Well, so like you said, I had been working for about 20 years as the features editor at Outside. And I had gravitated towards a lot of features on public lands. I wrote a column on the environment. That's our dog. So public land stories can be kind of dry, right? So in many ways, more ways than one. So we try to tell, like, pick an issue, but find a compelling story within it. So for, when Bears Ears was reduced to a smaller size national monument, we did a profile of the tribal lawyers who were working to restore the monument to size. When we wanted to do something on drought in the Colorado River, we sent a writer on a paddleboard down the pulse flow. So I'm used to kind of finding stories about public places that are more personal and have more of a narrative. So in 2019, I left Outside. I wanted to be more kind of in the conservation arena. And at that time, Madeline Kerry, who you'll hear from later at WildEarth Guardians, and Leah Barnett and the director, John Horning, were working with Torrey House Press to put together an anthology to celebrate the centennial of the Gila Wilderness. And Torrey House is an environmental nonprofit doing Western lands. And they've done a beautiful book earlier called Red Rock Stories in the original Designation run-up to Bears Ears. So the idea was this book that could be a beautiful book to have in your backpack and take with you in the Gila, and also a conservation tool. And Maddie and I started talking, and away we went. So I'm not a policy expert, but I'm used to really bringing together a bunch of writers that I think can illuminate a place.
With the background that you have, and particularly at Outside, and I know I think you had told me once before that you also served as environmental editor while you were there as well.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
What unique challenges or even opportunities did this project, First and Wild, present for you?
Well, so the main thing is that, there are a lot of stakeholders down in the Gila. We've got, New Mexico is a really diverse state. We have three main cultures that have been here forever. We have the indigenous cultures with the Pueblo in the north, and the Apache and the Navajo and others. We have the Hispanic American, the Mexican American tradition that has been here for, many hundreds of years. And then we have the new Anglo kind of influx from the past, maybe 150 years. And we also have a lot of conservation stakeholders down in the Gila. So there were a lot of people down there when I first called up and said, we're going to do this anthology. They were like, wait, who are you? We are the conservation groups that work in the Gila, and who's the Santa Fe editor coming in here, and who's Torrey House Press, and so we wanted to really make sure it was a book that any conservation group working on the Gila or elsewhere could use and put out to their constituency as an example of the celebration of these lands. And it wouldn't, the other worry was that it would endorse a single conservation prescription for this area, that it would have, that maybe WildEarth Guardians as a partner with Torrey House Press would have a specific agenda. And so people were kind of, well, I don't know, So, but then when it, became clear that we wanted to do a book that was really apolitical. I mean, there are a lot of radical political views within this, but they're very personal, and the essays are grounded in people's personal experiences and why the Gila, why they love the Gila. We really made sure that the writers had experience grounded in the Gila, and that they were speaking from the place, not just about the place, by a writer sent there.
So explain the journey then of selecting contributors for the book. From the outset, before even deciding who would contribute to this book, or who you would approach with the question of whether they would contribute to this book, what was it that you really sought to incorporate, and is there anything you were trying to avoid?
Well, a lot of wilderness anthologies over the years have been sometimes a little dry, like here's what wilderness is, and also full of white men, so there's a tradition from John Muir and Aldo Leopold on down of, a certain kind of wilderness writer that is most prevalent in these anthologies. So we really wanted to get all kinds of voices. And then we wanted to get beyond that person's platform into like their personal experience. So you see that Tom Udall wrote the introduction. He's done so much for the Gila. Senator Martin Heinrich here in New Mexico, he's introduced the Wild and Scenic Gila River Bill with Tom Udall when he was in the Senate. So Martin's story is not like, here's the policy for the Gila. It's, here's what happened when I went on my first AmeriCorps job, and my job was to count wolves, and I had to drive every 2 miles, get out of the car, howl, and see who howled back. So even the stories from people who are politically oriented were much more personal. So we started with those kind of people we definitely wanted to, who had been working on behalf of the Gila for so long. And then Madeline Kerry and Leah Barnett at WildEarth Guardians had a big web of contacts in the conservation community, from Carl Malcolm, who's a U.S. Forest Service ranger, to Gabe Vasquez, who's a youth activist who's running for Congress right now. And then Chiricahua Apache outfitter Joe Steins, who wrote a really amazing piece at the front of the book. And then the publisher of Tory House, Kirsten Johanna Allen, had a lot of literary ideas, including a wonderful Navajo writer, Alistair Bitsoy, who worked with Joe Steins, who wasn't a writer, to write his piece. And then it started being like pulling threads. Like I called Phil Connors, who's a fire lookout, who's written some really award-winning books about the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, where he's a fire lookout. And he was like, oh, did you know Beto O'Rourke backpacks through here? And Beto ended up writing a piece about this hot springs his dad used to go in the 70s, and how Beto would try to find it. And then there were a few just dream writers that, I called up Pam Houston, and I'm like, would you like to go try to see a wolf? And so she went down with Maddie, and Matt, there's some tracking where you can see where the wolves have been most recently, and they went and camped near the last sightings of the wolves, and Pam wrote a really cool piece about that. So it just was kind of a puzzle from there on about making sure that lots of people were included. But because Tory House has a really strong literary tradition, we didn't just want it to be a checklist of people who have been activists in the Gila. So
I'm not sure whether we can lump him into the category of contributors or not, but Aldo Leopold's article that first appeared in the journal of Forestry is contained within the book as well. This, as I understand it, was an article that subsequently was included in his proposal to his bosses at the U.S. Forest Service to create this designated wilderness area in the Gila National Forest. What sticks out to you about that article from Leopold?
Well, first, I loved it because it wasn't one I had seen a lot. It's not in Sand County Almanac. It's not like Thinking Like a Mountain, where he kills the wolf and It's not the articulation of his broader land ethic or what he thinks about conservation or wilderness. I loved the specificity. You know, it's like, here's what I mean by this crazy idea called wilderness, and here's how it would work in the Gila. So in many ways, it was, for one thing, it was a great grounding for the 100th anniversary of like, okay, here's what this looked like at the birth. You know, here's Leopold's idea. Here's what he submitted to his bosses. Here's what he envisioned by wilderness, which of course went on to have a huge life of its own. But two things I really loved about what he said about wilderness. One is that it's, what did he say? He said, it will be much easier to keep wilderness areas than to create them. In fact, the latter alternative may be dismissed as impossible. Right here is the whole reason for forehandedness in the proposed wilderness area policy. So I love that foresight right there, you know. And then I love the specificity of like a wilderness is a continuous big stretch of country in which that can absorb a 2-week pack trip. And like, you know, I've only gone on a couple of pack trips in my life. The longest was 1 week. But the idea that we would all be out there horse packing for weeks is still really great to me. So
he also and I think, you know, this is something that you note at one point in the book, or perhaps others do as well. He kind of talks about what led to this idea that he had, and it's very much the way that it's presented is it is in response in part to, you know, recreational pressures that were occurring that were leading to, you know, road building through areas that were previously untrammeled and much more development on the national forest than perhaps he thought that the national forest could sustain. Don't
you love that? He's like scores of tourists, you know, I'm like, right. Wait,
well,
really?
what I particularly liked about it is when I read that, I thought, wow, that is so much like today.
I mean, it's exactly like today. You know, maybe, you know, I mean, hopefully in 100 years, yeah, people will say, oh, the public lands were being overrun. Now they're not. But yeah, it's interesting to look back and think about what he saw.
So one of the things that I really enjoy about the anthology is that, you know, there is the timely tribute component of this being the 100-year mark of the designation of the Gila Wilderness, roughly. But you know, it also has the ability to shape how we collectively think about wilderness or even other protective designations across the West. I'm curious, did your outlook on wilderness designation change in, you know, putting together this book and editing this book, or even your outlook on the designation of the Gila Wilderness specifically?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a very pure feeling about wilderness, that it's, you know, where we go, what we all need. Wallace Stegner's wilderness letter, you know, we need to feel small in a big landscape more than ever. We need to feel awe. We need to be among wild creatures, away from screens, you know, and that nature needs a chance to be resilient on its own with, you know, as we face the pressures of climate change and drought and all kinds of things. So, but my definition of wilderness really expanded. I think now it has a lot of room to grow. I mean, I see it now also as something that we sort of plopped on from on high, like, hello, people of the Gila, you know, we now decree that this is wilderness to get out, you know. So I think I had a lot of education during the editing of the book. You know, the Apache concept of land stewardship is not the same as the Mexican-American relationship to the land, is not the same as the Leopold land ethic. And as I write in the intro, it's just a very American, brash, new country sort of view to roll up and pronounce like, this part of the country is going to be this. And when there were a lot of people who had been there using it in pretty light ways for many years, you know. So, and I think living in New Mexico, where we have those indigenous, Hispanic, and Anglo cultures, and they all value wild places, you know, more than the average bear because we're a very wild state, you know. It just now wilderness and the anniversary seems like a ripe opportunity to braid together those different strands of wisdom that have come through using this land, and invite more people into the definition of wilderness, I think.
So I want to dig a little bit further into that. You know, I see in First and Wildest kind of this exploration of what might seem like conflicting notions around the idea of wilderness.
Yeah, and
You know,
I
for
mean, because
example,
everybody has a different view. Yeah.
right. You know, even like Leanna Torres's example of the work she was doing involved in that took place in the wilderness of killing non-native fish, you know. And there are, you know, some contradictions. I think you hit on this a minute ago. Joe Sines noting that this pristine notion of wilderness is not at all reflective of how Native people used and appreciated the forest. But at the same time, there's a lot of possibility that I think is presented within the anthology as well. And on that note, you actually said within the introduction, you wrote that to all of the contributors, the Greater Gila represents one of our last opportunities to reimagine a land ethic that is inclusive, that is whole, and that is wild. Can you expand on that a little bit and what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, in part, I think you caught me out. I think that sounded good. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it's going to be. But, you know, when we went down and launched the book in Silver City last month, my family and I went out on horseback with Joe Sines. And, you know, he stopped, you know, it was really cool. We went into this dragonfly trail in the Arenas Valley outside of Silver City. And he took, you know, he would say like, okay, spread out so we're not all on one trail, you know, leaving a footprint. And then he showed us some of the ways that the Apache used to use the land. He's like, Apache didn't like to carry a lot. So he took a yucca frond, like 6 inches, like a little yucca spike, and he broke it off. And then he broke off the top, like 2 inches, the pointy part. And he with his fingernails, he started pulling fibers off the yucca. And then at the end with the point, he really got some fibers off the very top, and he had made a paintbrush. It was really cool, you know. And I mean, I sound so naive right now, but you know, these are, you know, and for his part, he's like, why, you know, they have bilingual signage here. Why isn't there Apache place name signage? You know, there's some easy ways that the Chiricahua Apache could be incorporated into the historical presentation of the Gila. And then when we had the virtual launch of the book, we had a webinar like this, and another of the contributors, Priscilla Solis Ibarra, I asked her the question, what can conservationists learn from the Mexican American tradition? And she kind of got on me in a good way. She was like, look, when we as conservationists define ourselves as conservationists, we sort of other everyone else as a non-conservationist. So that was really interesting how just by talking with a very, what I had viewed as a positive term, we can kind of draw a ring around ourselves and make it seem like everybody else doesn't care about land or the environment, you know? So, I mean, to get back to Leopold, I think, you know, a lot of these traditions, a lot of these cultures have a land tradition that is like, as Leopold said, the land holds philosophical and ethical value as opposed to just economic value. So I think that's where I'm talking about that land ethic that's more whole and more inclusive. And, you know, there are just a lot of perspectives that have been left out up to now and can really have a lot to bring, you know. And one thing I'm thinking about here in northern New Mexico, where we have the Hermit Peak Calf Canyon fire, those communities up there are traditional Hispanic communities that have been there for, you know, a couple hundred years. And generations and generations have lived on that land, and that's what they place value on. And, you know, nobody has better knowledge or ideas about those landscapes than they do, you know. So it's just inviting those people in.
Well, I think I have one more question I wanted to hit on before we get into Madeline's portion of the webinar. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you hope readers gain from First and Wildest?
Well, you know, at first, I hope it transcends policy. Like, it's the 100th anniversary, and I hope it can be the kind of book that you want to take in your backpack or to hot springs in the Gila and read chunks of, and just it brings to life this landscape that is not only pretty darn remote and rugged, but is also just off the beaten path. And so not a lot of people have been there. So, you know, you go into part of it and you can read about all these other places. Secondly, and you'll hear this from Maddie, but I think, you know, I want it to be used. I think one of the main points of the book is to be used as a conservation tool. Like that book, Red Rock Stories, was given to many of the senators and congressmen in Washington on the eve of the, you know, hopeful designation of Bears Ears as a national monument. And as we approach the 100th anniversary of the Gila and the 100th anniversary of Wilderness, the hope is that it can start a conversation among people, but also decision makers in Washington or Santa Fe or in Arizona, you know, about what's next for these wild places. And of course, not just the Southwest, but probably more likely the Southwest, since it is about the Gila. And then the last bit, I think, is just to remind people more broadly that, you know, the idea of wilderness, as much as it's changing and more people are demanding and rightfully a seat at the table, it's still one of America's best ideas. It's still vital. It's still alive. And I just think that's, you know, pretty great to know as we all try to stay resilient in the face of wildfires and drought and gun violence and, you know, ugly politics. So I just think it's a good reminder that America has some pretty great ideas, and this is one of them, and we can keep it going strong.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the conversation. I think you have wonderfully set the stage for Madeline Kerry. Madeline was born and raised in New Mexico, and she currently serves as WildEarth Guardian's Southwest Conservation Manager. She has a background in biology and urban studies and leads Guardian's Greater Gila and permit retirement campaigns. And let's see, I will get you set up here, Madeline.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Elizabeth, for that excellent introduction.
Sure.
So I'm going to talk a little bit, you know, just to pick up what Elizabeth handed to me, just briefly about like what's a conservation organization doing, investing in the book, and then I'm really going to get into like what is the Gila and why is it special, and why is it a focal point for not just WildEarth Guardians but so many groups. But before that, I'm going to start with a little gratitude. Incredibly grateful for Torrey House Press for partnering with us on this and making it happen. Incredibly grateful to Elizabeth for producing such a great book. Incredibly grateful to my team of Leah and Jack at Guardians, and Andrew and John and everybody else for making this project what it is and is all the things it's going to do. And we've been talking a lot about like, why a book? And I keep sort of changing my answer. And what I thought of when Elizabeth was talking was that anytime you talk to anybody about the Gila, whether you're in New Mexico or you bump into someone who loves the Gila in a more faraway place, there's this excitement, like they're letting you in on a secret, like they had their life changed and they're going to tell you about it. And when we talk to our sportsman partners who go turkey hunting, or if you talk with some of the ranchers who have permits down there who have been out riding on the landscape for, you know, 45 years. If you talk to people who went backpacking there as kids with the Boy Scouts, you talk to people who just went there for the first time because they're my friends and they say, hey, I want to know about the Gila. There's this little sense of magic and that it's this amazing place. And the book really feels like a way to capture that in a physical object and be able to take it places. And when you talk about doing advocacy, it's very easy to become a policy wonk and get hyper focused on the how, and to lose a little bit of focus on the why, and making it fun. Like, life is short, life is hard. The world feels incredibly traumatic and chaotic. And so having projects that are really about capturing magic and sharing it with people and giving people the fuel to go further than perhaps they would without being let in on the secret. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk about what the heck is the Greater Gila and where it's located. So this is a map that we use a lot at Guardians, and that vertical line you see in the middle is the New Mexico-Arizona border. And this is about, for those of you who know the Southwest, we're right smack in the middle of I-40 to north and I-10 to the south, about equidistant. And this is a map that shows the outline of what we call the Greater Gila bioregion, although it sort of grows and morphs depending on what communities we're working with. But at its core, you can see these wilderness areas, which are the Aldo Leopold, the Gila, the Blue Range Wilderness area, the Blue Range Primitive area, and then a couple smaller wilderness areas like Mount Baldy and Escadilla. And then in the light green are wilderness quality roadless lands that exist outside a designated wilderness area, but are on national forest lands, are open to the public. The vast majority of them are grazed. The vast majority of them see unauthorized illegal incursions from off-highway vehicles. And when we talk about why the Gila and why it's important, I think this map really puts into perspective all the cards that are still on the table when it comes to creating a big core protected habitat area in the Southwest. And we core protected habitat area rolls off my tongue, but when we're talking about protection, that encompasses a sense of decoupling federal land management from extractive industries like grazing and oil and mining for minerals, drilling for oil and gas, and logging. And it's also about recognizing and righting and correcting past wrongs in terms of how treaty rights were not honored by the US government, and really addressing some of what Elizabeth talked about with sort of some of the genocidal roots of the wilderness movement and the notion of who protected spaces are and are not for, and who should be stewards of them. And this is old wolf data on there, but those orange circles floating around was everywhere we sort of had occupied Mexican wolf habitat, which is where a pack had set up a territory. The entire landscape on this map is essentially now occupied Mexican wolf territory. They had a pretty good year last year in terms of the numbers they added to the wild population. Of course, not what we'd like to see. But Fish and Wildlife Service always sort of busts my chops to talk about the wolves in a positive light when I get a chance and say they are recovering. We are getting there. Maybe it's not as fast as Guardians and our partners would want. But this is sort of a map that tells a story of scale and opportunity. So if we go to the next map, it's going to just help y'all relate a little bit more. This is the Greater Gila geopolitical region. And you can see the Gila National Forest labeled. You can see blue Arizona. You can see where the interstates are in some of the towns that surround this area. Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, which is in the heart of the Gila Wilderness. And so this is just to give you all a better idea of communities that are in proximity. So a lot of the small communities we work in, like Springerville, McNary, Blue, Reserve, Glenwood, all of these teeny tiny communities are sort of the human component of the Greater Gila bioregion. So then we're going to go to a pretty picture, and I'm going to talk about a few things these maps don't communicate, which are like our key values in the Gila. Oh, this is also just to show you where it is in case you were lost on the continent. This is where we are in reference to a couple other key protected areas. All right, next slide. So when we talk about why the Gila, there's sort of a couple of things we primarily focus on. And I'm going to start with sort of the cultural values that exist there. And Elizabeth touched on some of them. Joe brings his Apache perspective into the book. But this was also the epicenter of the Mogollon culture, which was an entirely separate cultural world from contemporary indigenous communities that call the Gila home. And there's amazing artifacts all over the Gila. There's been a huge problem with grave robbing and looting as a general term. But there's amazing cliff houses that you can see if you're just hiking up one of the forks of the river. And there's a great essay from Jacob at Harvard about his relationship and his work studying some of that culture. And so there's a lot of human stories out on the landscape, from contemporary ones dating back almost 10,000 years. There's then the very obvious biodiversity story. The Gila National Forest has more species on it than Yellowstone National Park does. It's more biodiverse than Yellowstone. We, and the former Gila Forest supervisor who told me that, are proud of that. And we have the obvious iconic species like the wolf and elk and lion and bear, and javelina and the Gila trout. And then there are these smaller, lesser known species and plant species like the Mogollon death camas and the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse and the narrow-headed garter snake. And there's an amazing, I'm going to look at Leah, who's sitting in the room with me because I don't have the facts, but there was a scientist who saw 100 species of mammals in 3 miles of the Mimbres River, which is an incredible metric for biodiversity richness. To be able to see that many species of mammals, you would maybe expect to see that many species of insects, and fish combined, but not that many of mammals. So it's this incredibly biodiverse place. And then this gets into like, what does Guardians want to protect about the Gila? The Forest Service is very proud of Aldo Leopold and his legacy in the Gila, and it is a place that they talk about in their creation story and their myth about who they are as a place to do conservation. And there's a lot of pride that goes with that. All the ranger stations have little shrines to Leopold with artifacts. And when we think about what's possible in terms of protecting those roadless areas, being able to leverage that pride in an agency that is so hamstrung by their multiple use mandate, and is reeling from dealing with the climate and drought-driven mega fires. And we talk a lot about how the Gila is a key piece in really shifting that agency, not just on the Gila and Apache Sitgraves National Forest, but shifting how they work across the country, which is what Leopold was able to do when he was in this region and wrote his memo. And I think the fourth value I'll mention is fire. There's a lot of things I could talk about, but fire is feeling important right now. I think it was yesterday, the Black Fire, which is burning in the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, became the 3rd largest wildfire in New Mexico history, behind, of course, the Hermit's Cooks Peak, which is over 300,000 acres burning in the southern Sangres outside of our homes in Santa Fe, but then also the Whitewater Baldy Fire that burned primarily in the Gila Wilderness in areas north about a decade ago. And the Gila is a landscape where you can really feel the effects of having fire as a keystone process, some fairly unimpeded in the wilderness for over a century. And as we see horrible images of, high intensity fire rip through forests, and we see these stand replacing fires, the Gila is a place that doesn't have perfect fire ecology, but it is our best example of anywhere in the American West where we've let fire be wild for the past century. And as we learn how to deal with these bigger fires, adding more acres to a landscape where we can let fire do what fire does and learn how the ecosystems adapt to it feels incredibly important. So we can go to the next beautiful slide. And that's to give you a good sense of sort of what the Gila looks like. So I'm going to run just sort of through. So what are some of the threats to this landscape? Like any national forest system, it is intensely, deeply, daily threatened by livestock grazing and OHV use. There's been multiple proposals to use it as an area to do low altitude military overflights with chaff and flares. One of the largest copper mines in the world sits just a couple miles as the crow flies south of the Gila Wilderness's southern border. And there continues to be mining pressure today on the public lands and private lands that surround the wilderness. There's other extractive uses. On the Arizona side, there's an interest in doing some helium fracking. And we also see some small scale timber and commercial logging projects still being authorized by these forests. And perhaps, most importantly, the fossil fuel driven climate crisis and the mega drought that's striking the American West is challenging this landscape in a pretty unprecedented way. And so when we think about protecting the Gila, it's not a place where you say, oh, there's going to be a tar sands mine, and so we need to put some lines on a map to deal with that. It's much more complex. Like, we don't have a good model for how you work with the military to protect quiet airspace over protected lands. The Boundary Waters Wilderness Area is the only place that does that. So it's been really challenging, but also fulfilling to be in an advocacy role, thinking about, we have this amazing place we need to protect. It has these really distributed, diverse threats, and what's the path forward? So Guardians is involved in a handful of campaigns. There's a handful of campaigns that are being led by our partners. Our primary work there is led by Leah and Jack, working on trying to work with communities and partners and talk about what is the protection vision, and start this conversation that we're sort of having tonight. How do we do this? What are the policy opportunities? What does the community want and need? What is the agency interested in doing? And how can we, do Leopold's vision justice? And importantly, how can you engage the tribal community and build on the work done at Bears Ears when it comes to co-management, build on the work that's being done at Grand Canyon around co-stewardship, and really continue to push the agencies to do a better job on nation-nation relationships when it comes to land management. Guardians does a lot of wolf work that's primarily focused on litigation and trying to get the Forest Service to better manage livestock and the risk livestock operators pose to wolves, as well as getting Fish and Wildlife Service to implement a better management plan. We have some other endangered species like the jumping mouse and the garter snake that I mentioned that we work with. We worked in a large coalition involving lots of other partners to submit a massive comment letter on the Gila Forest Plan that's currently sitting in the Washington office. And we sent in coalition a supplemental letter asking them to include the maximum number of acres of recommended wilderness in the plan as a way of implementing the 30 by 30 vision. So for you policy wonks out there, that's like one of the rubber meeting the road, right? We can't advance these wilderness bills until we get the recommendations out of the agencies, and we can't do big things legislatively if we don't have the agency's administrative buy-in. There's a wild and scenic bill that was introduced for a second time by Senators Martin Heinrich and Ben Ray Lujan that would do hundreds of miles of wild and scenic protections on the Gila and San Francisco rivers. And that's been a really key bill for a lot of our partners. It's mostly been led by New Mexico Wild and the Wildlife Federation. To protect the river. And then we've worked on a speculative mining project. So that's to give you guys a sense of sort of the threats, protections, opportunities, why the Gila, and I'm going to sort of hand it off to Todd to talk about more of the rubber meeting the road. And I think what I'll leave you with is when Guardians thinks about what's possible, what's right to do in the Gila, we think about three things. We think about going really big. So many of our conservation projects, we start small before we even get there because we're worried about opposition. We think about going across the New Mexico-Arizona state line. It's been a long time since we've had a bi-state designation, and we think that we're really ready to start challenging political boundaries that cut through ecosystems. And we think about changing the culture of the agencies. And it's likely that a mosaic of opportunities and designations are what is going to lead us there, and there's not going to be one single one. But that's sort of our preliminary answer to the question of what do we do in the Gila? And I think Todd's going to talk a little bit more about the different things that could make up that mosaic.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. I just want to remind everyone real quick that if you have any questions during the course of these presentations, drop them into the Q&A section, and we will field as many of them as time allows toward the end. With that, I will hand the floor over to Todd Tucci. Todd is Senior Attorney at Advocates for the West. Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have the unenviable task of following those two great presentations and kind of zooming out from the Gila Wilderness and trying to bring some historic and contemporary context to protecting large landscapes across the American West. And moreover, I have about 3 minutes to do it because we want to make sure that we take some questions. You know, but really, this isn't 1924 when a young Forest Service ranger could or would submit a report to his DC bosses recommending the Forest Service protect over 400,000 acres of the National Forest as wilderness, a term that was not even defined in statute or regulation at that time. But that doesn't mean that there are no processes in place or mechanisms in place to protect tomorrow's Gila Wilderness or protect the wildlands of the American West that play a critical role in building resiliency in the face of the perils of climate change and providing refuge to the demands of the 21st century. In fact, there are more opportunities and avenues to protect the wildlands and landscapes of the American West than there have ever been. Next slide, Will. And so I'm going to zoom out from the Gila, and frankly, wilderness, while it is the gold standard for protection of all that's great about wildlands and wildlife habitat, it's but one designation out there. There are a host, both through presidential proclamations like the national monuments. For those of you who followed, I bet of the attendees, everyone has heard of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments at this time. But those aren't the only, those come through presidential proclamations, of course, but national conservation areas, national scenic and historic areas. These are both congressionally designated management requirements to protect, conserve, and restore the ecological, wildlife, recreational, scientific, and other purposes. There are, in the same vein, wild and scenic river designations that Maddie referenced earlier, and there's wilderness study areas. Each one of these management paradigms has a role to play in the mosaic of protections across the American West. National conservation areas don't need to be managed like the non-impairment standard of wilderness. There is some more diversity of uses in some of these areas than others. Will, next slide. And this is just on BLM lands. You'll see, and I hope that's big enough, but this is the BLM's national conservation lands as defined and created in 2009 by the Omnibus Public Lands Act. And so you see there's hiking trails, there's wild and scenic rivers, there's wilderness, WSAs, national conservation areas. And you can see that some of these areas are sprinkled, it's sprinkled all across the American West. But you know what I focus on in this picture? I focus on the tan lands. Those are the BLM lands. Those are the lands that have a constituency in each of the towns, the 50, 80, 200 towns that Maddie was mentioning, sprinkled across the American West, that these lands have a constituency, and there is an opportunity, because each one of those lands, there is a group, an individual, or a team fighting to protect these lands. And it doesn't have to be wilderness. It can be a wilderness study area. It can be a national conservation area. There are ample opportunities in law and regulation to protect the landscapes that we care about. Next slide. And it is not just through Congress or a presidential proclamation that we can create these added management paradigms to protect the landscapes that we love. There are some that are done administratively. I don't have time, and I'm not going to get into it. But there are, for example, wilderness study areas that the BLM, although it's abrogated its responsibility since 2003, it has the opportunity to designate itself WSAs, wilderness study areas. There's also areas of critical environmental concern, and you can see what it's there. Call me if you want to know about it. But this here too presents BLM with an opportunity, well, presents folks like you and me with an opportunity to engage with the BLM management deciders, explain why this particular landscape needs to be protected, and the important historic, cultural, and scenic values. And the BLM can make this decision. This does not have to be the heavy lift of getting legislation or the super heavy lift of getting a presidential proclamation. Next slide. There's others. It's not just the ACECs. There's the lands with wilderness characteristic, or the roadless areas that Maddie talked about. Here again, BLM has the authority right now on to accept nominations for lands with wilderness characteristic and areas of critical environmental concern, identify appropriate management mechanisms designed to protect, restore, and enhance the areas that are LWCs or WSAs, and we don't have to go to Congress to get this protection. Next slide. Or is that it? Okay, see, I told you I was going to be fast, and Bill, I'm almost done. Well, here's a section 202 WSAs. My point here is not everything needs to be wilderness. It is the gold standard. It remains the gold standard, but there are a number of opportunities out there to engage the fight to protect the area that you care about. If it does not meet the requirements for wilderness, that doesn't mean it doesn't need protection. And there's a whole host of ways to do that. Advocates for the West is working with Conservation Lands Foundation and its 80 friends groups sprinkled all the way across the American West and some in Florida to protect these landscapes, whether it's the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area that's inundated with unauthorized livestock grazing, or if it's the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area in southern Utah, where Secretary Bernhardt proposed a 4-lane high-speed highway right through the National Conservation Area. We're here to help you protect these landscapes, whatever designation, whatever value it is you're trying to protect. Sorry, Will, I went over.
No problem. Thank you very much, Todd. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Elizabeth. We do have time for a few questions, and it looks like we've got a couple at this point also. So I will just dive into those. The first one perhaps is a piggyback on your presentation, Todd. The question is there any movement to get WSAs in BLM and roadless areas in U.S. Forest Service designated as wilderness? So let's say those designations have already occurred that you talked about, whether it be a WSA, ACEC, but we're looking for the gold standard. What is happening, or even what does it take in getting that standard for those lands?
Well, I can certainly talk about this, but I think I'm going to pass it to Maddie to talk about what they're doing in the Gila to get lands designated. And Maddie, I can take it back if you want.
Oh, well, why don't you start with sort of, I think, like the policy question.
Right. So we all know in 2 minutes, wilderness has to be congressionally designated. There is no alternative. The president cannot proclaim wilderness. The BLM cannot independently proclaim wilderness. There are wilderness campaigns all over the American West that I'm aware of, where people are moving. It's a legislative process, folks. You got to build your allies. You got to diversify your allies. You got to bring your friends close and your enemies closer. You got to all go up to Congress and tell them why this is not just good for the critters and the tree huggers, but why it's good for the local economy, why it's good for the ORV users. We need to find more allies. So this is just a normal legislative process. You put together a campaign, you have a goal to designate wilderness, and you start hitting the ground in Washington, D.C., as well as with county commissioners, with local leaders. And you should have, and Maddie and Elizabeth can talk about this, you should have a 5 to 15 year time horizon. This won't happen overnight, but if you keep at it, you might find it.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that, what I would add is, right, we talk about like, what is 30 by 30? What are we doing with 30 by 30? And I read that question and I was like, 30 by 30 would just be a bill that nationwide said eligible lands shall be wilderness. And so I think I don't think that's strategic legislatively to do right now, because I think it would freak people out. But I do think when we're talking about how do we move the ball in the biodiversity and climate crises, thinking about this question and then going to the toolbox Todd presented and saying, like, can we safeguard against biodiversity loss in some of the key drivers of the climate crisis through other designations that maybe we can get done without the massive coalition building over many decades that wilderness can take.
And I just one final thing, and this is the beauty of operating in this sphere today. The question is there a movement to get WSA's designated wilderness? There's not one movement, there's probably 500 movements. And that's why this is interesting and dynamic, because what will move the needle in Custer County, Idaho is different than what will move the needle in Owyhee County, Oregon, which is different than what will move the needle in Coconino County, Arizona. So we need to be focused intently and like a laser on local communities. What do they need and what moves the needle? So it's not one movement coming from DC. It's 500 movements emanating from those towns sprinkled across the American West that are going to be responsible for conservation in the 21st century.
All right, thank you guys. For the next question, Todd noted on his slides in his presentation the wild and scenic status as one possible designation for protection. What is the status with the Gila Wild and Scenic River Bill?
So to the best of my knowledge, we're waiting for a hearing date to get scheduled. So it has been introduced into the US Senate jointly by both New Mexico senators, and we're waiting for it to get scheduled. I say that I'm almost 99% sure that's the case because I know that some hearings got scheduled today and word is sort of percolating out. But then there'll be a hearing and we move forward in the legislative process. And I think, then we wait for these 500 small communities to also have their legislation move forward. And then we start to get maybe an omnibus package on the horizon. And that's really how we've seen, it's funny to say in my experience, because I feel like I'm so young, but in my experience of 8 years, all the big omnibus packages have been right when somebody wants a war memorial upgraded or expanded, and somebody else wants to do a wilderness area, and somebody else wants to do some wild and scenic, and you get enough of these small things, and then we get the big thing, and we move on to what's next.
All right, we have time for one more question. This is something that Elizabeth talked a lot about in terms of the indigenous perspective in say the concept of wilderness. We've been talking about, federal land management practices. What really is the role of tribes in improving, or what is happening with tribes in improving or transforming federal land management practices?
That's a great question. So I will say I'm not a tribal member, so I'm going to speak from my policy perspective. And I think it's very different across the landscape. Every tribal nation is different and unique. But broadly, there is a movement supported by conservation groups to improve what our model of consultation looks like. Because right now, the federal government says, here, we've come up with this plan to do this thing. Can you tell us if you care about it? And there's this model from the international community called free, prior, informed consent, where Indigenous communities have the opportunity to direct land management on lands that they traditionally had stewardship over. So it's, as Todd said, it's a diverse, distributed effort, which is the strongest way to have a movement. And it's broadly focused on sort of flipping the script on how the agencies do the formal legal process of consultation.
Yeah, and totally agree, Maddie, and I'll just build on that. So it's not just formalities in terms of how they engage the consultative process and the National Historic Preservation Act or otherwise. Really, what I think there is a movement afoot, and if you want to hear more about this, you should read Charles Wilkinson, professor of law over at Boulder, who talks about traditional knowledge and how do we get out of the way, stop thinking we're the center of the mirror, and start incorporating traditional knowledge into our land management decision making. It's not easy, but that's where we're heading, and that is an exciting possibility because we tend to do it with the scientific method. Scientific method is one management approach, but incorporating traditional historic knowledge about how species and landscapes interweave together is a difficult task, but boy, it opens up possibilities into the future.
All right, well, thank you, Madeline, Todd, and Elizabeth for your time, your insights, your inspiration this evening. And thank you to our attendees for tuning in. The important work that groups like Advocates for the West and WildEarth Guardians are doing is made possible thanks to the generosity of supporters like you who are with us tonight. If you do feel inspired this evening, we hope that you will give a gift to one or more of our organizations to help us continue this work. We will be sending up a follow-up email to attendees that will include links to these organizations, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar on YouTube. Please feel free to share that email far and wide with folks who you think might be interested in our work. And as a reminder, for purchases of the anthology First and Wildest through the end of the day today, Torrey House Press is generously donating 20% of sales to Advocates for the West. Check your email from this morning for a discount code and link to the page where the book can be purchased. This is the final Voices for the West webinar this spring. It's been a great run. Thank you all for supporting us and tuning in. We'll take a break this summer, but look for some info on our fall slate of Voices for the West webinars in the months ahead. And with that, I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.